lastly, we want to know what to do when we see powers of I. So what we're going to be doing right now is looking at a pattern that appears. Because, you know, I is the square root of -1, right? And we know that if we square that, you get, you know, square root of -1 squared, which is -1. Now, if you cube that, that's like multiplying I by itself 3 times. So that's like I squared times I, right? So I squared is -1, so this is just going to be the same as -1 times I, negative I to the 4th power, think of that as -I, or like I cubed, times I again, which will be -I times I. This is -1, so -1, +1. So we kind of cycle around here. You got I, -1, I, 1. Let me just write that short one more time for you. So I to the 1st power is just I. I squared is -1. I cubed is -I. I to the 4th is +1. Now, multiply by I again, you get I to the 5th, right? So multiplying this by I, 1 times I is just I. I to the 6th, so multiply this by I again, is really just I squared, which is -1. I to the 7th power is multiplying -1 times I, so we get -I. And I to the 8th is -I times I again, which is +1. See how it cycles around? I, -1, I, 1. If we were to keep going, multiply by I again, you get I to the 9th is I. I to the 10th will be -1. I to the 11th will be -I. And I to the 12th is 1. So notice, I to the 4th, I to the 8th, I to the 12th. These are all multiples of 4. So every time we got like a group of 4 factors of I, it's 1. One more time. Let's do I to the 13th, I to the 14th, I to the 15th, I to the 16th. This will be I, -1, I, 1. So this pattern is going to continue. Every group of 4 is just 1, and then it cycles around I, I, or I, -1, I, 1. So in general, if we had something, say, I to the 20th, notice 20 is a multiple of 4. So it would be 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So we will land back at 1 again. How about I to the 400th power? Well, 400 is a factor, or is a multiple of 4. So it will kind of end at the bottom here of this loop. So I to the 400th power should be 1 as well. What if I had I to some power that's not a multiple of 4? Say I to the 41st power. Let me just recognize that should really be like I to the 40th power and then times 1 more I. I to the 4, if you can pull out a multiple of 4 here, that's going to be 1 times I, which is just I. So if you have any number, say I to the 75th power, think about, can 4 go into 75? You can do this on your calculator, right? 75 divided by 4. It doesn't, but that's like the whole number part is 18, right? 4 times 18 is 72, right? So you could think of this as I to the power 72, and then times how many more i's to get 75 factors of I? You need 3 more. So I to the 72, that is a multiple of 4. So I to the 72 will just be 1 times I cubed. And I cubed, we know, will be negative I. So that's how I to the 75th is going to simplify. Let's just do one more. Let's say I to the 127th power. Okay? So I can even do this by hand by thinking about how many times does 4 go into 127. So divide this by 4. You can do long division if you like, or use your calculator like we did with the last problem. 4 goes into 127. Let's see, that's 3 times 4 times 3 is 12. Subtract, bring down the 7. 4 goes into 7 once. 1 times 4 is 4. Subtract, you get a remainder of 3. So this will be like I to the power, what was it? 31 times 4 is 124. So it's like I to the power 124, which is a multiple of 4, times remainder of 3. I to the power 3, which should be, this is 1, times I cubed, which will be negative I. So in this way, you can really evaluate I to any power just by using this pattern. I negative 1, negative I 1. If you can do that, just take whatever the power is, think about what's the closest multiple of 4 and how many is left over, and then you can evaluate by just doing the leftover, the remaining factors of I.